Aren't you also, though, interested in the whole issue of Holocaust deniers?
I am very much so, and I started this book thinking that it was sort of the province of people who believed the Earth was flat and we never landed on the moon and there are green men over in New Mexico. And I found out that that's not the case. And actually, while I was working on the book, just sort of monitoring the various websites, case after case of this minister in Europe saying this ridiculous thing, that there was no anti-Semitism in Romania or something like that. And this one after the other, that flat out Holocaust denial like we would see from a person like Mel Gibson's father, or shades of it, is very, very pervasive today. It is absolute gospel truth within the Muslim world. They believe that this never happened. It was an invention by the Jews. I mean, it has really pervaded Islamic thinking about, and it's a real thing. And so the story has a spine about denial, both the denial of the Holocaust and this weird denial, the strange denial that took place within families.
Absolutely. You know, I came to read it after a couple of years ago. I made a trip with a Northwestern alumni group to, my husband didn't want to go to Eastern Europe, and I can certainly sympathize with that, but we were in Prague, where there is a marvelous, still, old Jewish community synagogue. I was the only person on the tour that knew I needed to visit on Friday. The rest of them all thought they'd go on Saturday, and I started to say,
Shabbat.
and I thought, and I'll have it by, to myself, so I kept quiet. But there's not only is the cemetery, but the memorial to the camp, which is very much like the Vietnam Wall, with all the names on the walls and all, is so stark and so tremendously moving and tear-producing and whatever. And from there, we went by train en route to the Danube to Nuremberg. And I want to tell you what, it was as though, going around Nuremberg, it was as though the guide and the various people we talked to were referring to what the South calls the late unpleasantness. I mean, it was a really spooky, I mean, I'd just been in Prague looking at this, and now I'm in Nuremberg, where basically they are saying, no big deal, was just the late unpleasantness, taking you to see the buildings where the war crime trials were held, taking you to see where Hitler actually spoke, and the whole thing was just complete, sanitize it, denial, make it history and all. I was flabbergasted. It's the first time I had run into Holocaust denial on a personal basis.
I chose Vienna for the setting for this story for a reason. I mean, the Viennese, the Austrians, really did engage in a kind of denial themselves for many years.
And before the war, too. Weren't they the ones who behaved that way before the putsch?
Anti-Semitism has a long and sorry history in Austria. Although Vienna had it was a thriving Jewish community. It produced, the list goes on and on of great musicians, artists, writers, Freud. But it took me from Vienna to the Czech Republic, my research did, to Warsaw and Treblinka, and back to Israel. So I sort of made this loop of this book. Being in Poland and being out there and going to Treblinka and finding the camp and walking there, it was an experience that I will never forget. I visited the camp on a day very much like I described in the book, just bitterly cold day in October. And it just takes your breath away still, and I'll just never forget it.
You wrote very movingly about it on your website. I went to visit danielsilva.com.
danielsilvabooks.com.
Is it books.com?
I had to because there's I think it's a freight forwarding company in New Zealand that has my name.
I'm glad you said that. Actually, my shortcut was to Google,
Yeah.
Daniel Silva, and then I didn't
comes
actually look. So thank you, danielsilvabooks.com. And I thought you wrote a very interesting and very moving description of your research this, and I was going to ask you, Treblinka sounds as though if you didn't know anything about it, if you went there, you wouldn't really have any keen awareness of why it was a memorial. Little bitty sign, you
They
know,
had a,
heavily reforested.
Well, it was reforested by the Germans, of course. But it was always tucked into the woods for a reason, the White Forest of Poland. Yeah, you could drive right by it, and they just had these tiny little signs, and my driver kept missing them, and we were lost for a while, so we had to go through this rather bizarre sequence of pulling peasants over on the side of the road and saying which way to Treblinka, and finally found it. And it is a startlingly beautiful memorial. The government did it. It's almost too beautiful, but every Jewish community that was destroyed there is represented by an appropriately sized stone, with a large stone in the middle of this meadow representing the Warsaw Ghetto. And the tracks, the railroad tracks, have been rebuilt in stone, and the rail platform has been rebuilt in stone. To get into the camp, you have to go over the real railroad track that you can hear that thud, 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 thud as you enter the camp. And it was, and I had it all to myself. That was it was no one else there. I hear 2 zlotys and go in. And it was just, I'm glad I went.
I'm sure it lends an emotional resonance to the writing. Do you do that at the end of your books? Do
I
you
do
write
it at
the
the
story
end.
and
Yeah,
then
I
do
work on story, story, story. In fact, I wrote a version of that chapter before I had visited, and I ended up changing very little, actually. I got it right, so I just made a few little geographic changes to get some things right. But you know, the dialogue and all the important things about the scene between Gabriel and our guy, they all stayed the same.
So undoubtedly one reason why your books have been so successful as fiction is that the story comes first with you and then all of this supports it.
Yeah.
There's a terrible danger, I think, a lot of writers fall into it, is you fall so in love with the research. I've been trained in the British pronunciation. Sorry, I don't dare say research anymore, as I get hammered in London. So I have to say research. But then what happens, of course, is it begins to overweight the story, or the story becomes shaped by what and you don't want to leave bits of it out. So it sounds to me as though you keep the story paramount.
Story first, and I have a couple of tricks for doing it, in that I get the story concept, broad outlines of the story, do enough research to get going, and then start writing, and then I research as I go along, and I get just enough research to do what I need. And you got to dramatize it. That's what happens. You know, people just tell stuff, and just spill what they've learned onto the page without a scene around it, or some good characterization. That's when it becomes bloated and bad and weighty.
Or leaden.
Leaden.
Yes.
I mean, we could go through the book chapter by chapter, but you know, the Austrian experience after the Anschluss is dramatized by a man named Max Klein, very effectively, I think. The Vatican's assistance to war criminals is done within the context of a debate, really, between Gabriel and the Pope's secretary. So I just try to use little tricks to show and dramatize rather than to just tell. When you feel yourself telling, just stop and think of some other way to do it.
I do think that the salient feature of the books is they suck you right through the story. I mean, I always enjoy, traversing it without pausing to have to skip or skipping over some chunks of research. I find myself increasingly skipping parts of books. There's too much middle in a great number of books today, but yours I read.
Too much middle. I've never heard that phrase. Too much middle.
Too much middle. You know what? A really great novel has to have the end as good as the beginning. You have to have a payoff for the journey, or the reader feels cheated. But if it sags a bit in the middle, it's not so bad. And I find that a lot of books have really got unnecessary filler, but not yours. I think your pacing is particularly good.
Well, I cut tremendous amounts late in the process.
I'm not surprised. Most people, although it's hard for non-writers to understand that, I think actually most people overwrite, and the real secret of a really great book is to cut away the excess verbiage and get down to making a lean
scenes and scenes and scenes.